Engineering, Magic, and Kitsune, Book 1, Chapter 69, Thermobaric. It wasn't quite the sound of an active machine shop, but something about it was comforting nonetheless. It had been some time since John had the opportunity to work in a shop with someone. Anything to get his mind off that damned awkward ride home. Yuki had tried to make conversation a few times, but he just wasn't feeling it. The weight of the responsibility bore on his shoulders like Atlas's own burden. He had caused deaths. It was his duty to make sure that there weren't more. She seemed willing to leave him alone for a while, at least, especially when he had said he had some ideas to finish up some projects. John glanced over at Yusuke, watching the man work the coin press with a careful eye. The undead poured metal into the bin before slowly cranking the melter. A pale, heatless beam washed over the assorted scraps. Slowly, they liquefied into a thin metal slurry, dripping through the filter before landing in a secondary tank below, rising to the full line. Then Yusuke twisted a valve, allowing the liquid metal to flow into the molds below. A minute later, measured with an hourglass, all that was needed was a quick press of a button to harden the coins into a solid state, and a bit of fining to remove the taintings, which could easily be recycled into new coins afterwards. In retrospect, maybe he should have scaled the molds to make more than 40 coins. It wasn't as if he had run into any scaling problems, with the order beam spreading far enough until the mid-hundreds. He should also implement some sort of contingency later that would destroy the device if it left the fort. It was a temporary measure, so the machine wouldn't be important for long, but it was a device that could potentially pump out hundreds of near-flawless counterfeits of an actual mon per minute. The last thing he needed was to get implicated in the largest financial fraud operation on the planet. If there was anything this nameless debacle taught him, it's that they took their coins seriously around these parts. Sighing, he turned back to his own project, pulling a crystalline wire from his security tablet. Fact 1. The nameless would quickly notice a huge portion of their hoard being devalued in real time. Well, he didn't expect them to stop immediately. It was safe to assume that creatures with an innate sense for value would rapidly notice something was wrong. Fact 2. With how spread out their hive entrances were, neither John nor Yuki could personally block them fast enough to prevent significant spillover from angry spider monsters leaving their nests once disturbed. Fact 3. Fire-aligned magical crystals tended to explode when ground up and shaken too much. Entropy-aligned magic crystals tended to rapidly destabilize themselves and accelerate nearby processes if they were broken. And finally, Fact 4. His security system had already provided a means to receive a signal remotely, and had the reach to travel through several kilometers of open air with the aid of scuffed radio-ish transmitters attached to the sensors. He just had to reverse the process a bit. John had scavenged the metal banks around the compound and pulled the linked components out of the security tablets, leaving him with only the outer and innermost detection nets. The plan was simple. Make the equivalent of full-air explosives, plant them, remotely detonate them when the time was right. The biggest problem was figuring out how to plant them, but his fight with that damned AleCuevo bastard had given him some inspiration. The effect of the magic-coated arrow, for all intents, was a slowing one. However, it truly operated by making the area around the target hard to move through. That meant that if something didn't exert enough force, it wouldn't move at all. So, what if he didn't have to plant the explosives? What if he could just leave them like loitering munitions above this target? An airburst fuel air explosive would do a hell of a lot more damage than a conventional one, especially since he couldn't get too close to the center of their nest structures. The first part of the mechanism was quite simple. A pole with 2 metal fingers connected to a trigger, which, like someone might use back home to pick up trash without bending over. Towards the head was the same slow-coated focus, scavenged from his crossbow, but with a few important energy inputs purposely blocked off. According to his quick tests, it did what he expected, leaving a thinner but much longer-lasting coating of distilled slowness on top. Sure, the prongs of the device got caught in the field, but they were easy to yank free. The outside of the device was a waterproof bag with an attached length of cloth for a carrying strap, all of which he dyed grey with bone meal, disguising the device as a little tuft of cloud. Even if the spider spotted it at 500 meters in the air, it shouldn't alarm them. Even if it did, Kiku was probably the only yokai with flight they had access to, and if Yuki was to be believed, she was pretty much Kitsune's soup right now. The payload was a bunch of ground-off crystals and simple, one-time-use capacitors, hastily thrown together, but probably stable enough. No real foci were needed, as John only had to rely on the elements doing what they did naturally, rather than shaping them in any particular way. It kept it cheap, fast to produce, and lightish. Wired up to the sensor was a pin that would lightly crack an emptiness-aligned capacitor encased in a metal can with a hole in the bottom, punching a hole through the slowing field when it received an activation signal. Next to it were lead weights, which made the explosive bottom heavy, so it stayed pointed down. Early tests showed that the slowing field still clung to the sides, too, stopping it from being knocked off course by wind or slow projectiles. It would have been an easy matter to rig it to explode on impact, but he decided he needed something a bit more potent. The ground, generally speaking, had greater magic content than the air, so with a bit of experimenting, he managed to create a dial-a-height sensor for initiating the final stage, which only became active after a second after it started falling. Air and togetherness would draw in extra air, more fuel for the process. A delayed charge of emptiness would explode the bag and toss the spherical capsules far and wide. Then fire would do as fire does best. He really fucking hoped that the shape of all things was as good at preventing the spread of forest fires as it was cracked up to be, because he was throwing a fuel air bomb at every single nameless nest entrance they found. After a few hours of work, John was done. Every single bomb was completed, though he made sure to slot in a manual toggle to arm them to avoid any potential accidents. Now he had to get ready. The fight would be short. John got up from his seat, cracking his back and waving to Yusuke, who returned a nod as he stared at his book. Honestly, John still had no idea how his vision worked, given the undead snack of eyes, but it felt too rude to ask. John slid the door open, only to behold darkness. At first, he thought it was a nighttime and panic struck him. A quick glance revealed no stars and occasional spots of fading light showing through black clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance. A momentary flash of lightning cutting through the deep gloom across the land as rain began to patter onto the wet ground below. He cursed under his breath. During World War II, officials ordered people to turn their lights off to hide from air raids at night. When he had learned that in high school, it almost seemed quaint. How could you miss an entire city, even in the dark? Yet, he knew he was no better than those men. He had no night vision lenses, no GPS, no thermals. How the hell was he going to find some silk structures in the woods? He could try to rig a longer-range nameless detector, but just scanning the area would take hours. It was time they didn't have. Yuki's speech to the populace of Broadstream was probably due soon. Yuki. His lips pulled tight. John trusted the Kitsune. He really did. But the fact that she hid Yasuro's death, how long would she have let it ride? Just until after the crisis. Did she think that she would whisper it in his ear and convince him that the man retired to a nice farm upstate? Like it or not, John was in some way responsible for his death. The man was clearly terrified of John, but he was truly trying his best for his people. Unlike those damn priests, had he... No. He was not getting bogged down again. He had to push on, for all the people he hurt, for all the people he got killed. Maybe he could ask Rin for help. The dragon-blooded Unbound seemed to have senses that worked just fine during storms, but how was her low-light vision? Moreover, he hadn't flown her near the nests before. Sure, she might be able to point out a nest to him, but she would be of no use for navigating. Navigating by flight was difficult. You just weren't used to seeing familiar landmarks from a whole new angles. He needed the Kitsune's seemingly eidetic memory and night vision. There was no other option. Glancing around the courtyard for the Kitsune, he saw her sitting under the eaves of the main building, patiently meditating on the deck with an almost serene expression on her muzzle. The Kitsune's eyes were closed, and her legs were crossed, her 9 tails perfectly still behind her. John supposed there wasn't really a reason for the Kitsune to hide it anymore, was there? Rin knew. He knew. Yusuke probably didn't care, honestly. He doubted that the man would care too much if she realistically sacrificed a criminal every Sunday. But it'd still be a step up from his previous employers. John steeled himself before striding over to her. He had no doubt that she already knew he was coming. Did she know he knew? Surely she did. given her raw intellect. So why the farce? Why only crack her eyes open when he was a few steps from her? "John," she greeted quietly, eyes flicking open and knocking onto his. "How goes your project?" "Bombs are done," John stated. "We have explosives to cover the nest entrances, and they'll fly and look a little cloud-like until I say so, and they all land within seconds of one another." She nodded sagely, the edges of her muzzle gently carving into a smile. "Good. Thank you, John." The Kitsune was far less surprised than he expected about how fast he solved the problem, but he supposed that making a one-time device that went boom was quite a lot easier than throwing together a hoverboard in an afternoon. "I need your help, though," he hesitantly admitted, his hand idly going to his wrist that was nearly broken earlier this very day. "The skies are growing dark. My night vision isn't as strong as yours." A beat. Yuki's eyes widened a hair. "You wouldn't take Rin instead?" The question was innocuous at first blush, but that wasn't how this game was played. John swallowed roughly, tearing his gaze from the Kitsune. "I'm still a bit angry about Yashiro, but she doesn't have the same grasp of this land from the air as you do. You remember where all the nests are, right? Can you help me with these? I can't quite attach them all to the outside of my backpack." Her expression was utterly unchanged, although she dipped ahead. "Of course. Are you ready to depart?" John nodded in return, quickly heading back to the shop to grab the explosives and hand them off to her, which she'd soon wrapped up in her tails before setting the hover disc down. The two climbed onto it together, the Kitsune's arms gently wrapped around him, as if to catch him should he stumble, and they were off into the darkness. The gloom of the storm swallowed them whole as they raced away from safety. If not from the patter of rain, it was almost as if they were sailing through a pitch-black void, cut from the rest of the world and left with none but each other. They had to move fast, though. The disc only had so much capacity. Perhaps John ought to install a way to feed power from his gauntlet into the disc. "Where to, Yuki?" he asked. An arm slowly unwrapped from around him, pointing off into the distance. He could hardly see. "Yeah, that's not going to work. Mind using clock directions?" John asked the Kitsune. "What's a clock?" Yuki asked, causing John to groan. "Right." He found references to some, but they were basic, to say the least. On top of that, there was no guarantee that Yuki would have seen a clock before, given the length of her imprisonment. Besides, they probably didn't use the same system he was familiar with either. Splitting a day into 12 hours was pretty arbitrary. "Right, it's relative to where you're already facing. Straight ahead is 12, 3 is directly to our right, 6 is behind us, 9 to our left," John quickly explained, and he could feel the Kitsune's fingers drum against his arm as she absorbed the instructions. A curious system. "Move ahead to 2.5 then," the Kitsune confirmed. Carefully, John spun the disc to match her heading before zipping off, the wind whipping through their hair, and the rain stung his face like tiny daggers, although it was nowhere near as frigid as the last storm he had to endure. Higher and higher they flew, until the ground was a distant memory, somewhere deep in the dark. Silently, the pair flew, Yuki occasionally calling out a new direction to John. It was a small mercy that he wasn't afraid of heights. Besides, it wasn't as if Yuki would allow him to fall, and even if he did, she'd probably dive after him and use the same thing that let her float while meditating with Rin to slow their fall. Of course, it might pose a slight issue if that happened over a nameless nest entrance, but he tried not to think of that one. "There is a nest up ahead. Slow down," Yuki commented, barely heard over the building storm. "Heard," John replied, shifting his feet to gradually bring the hover disc to a crawl. "Stop. Here," Yuki said. "Got it." At that, John hard stopped the disc, moving his leg off the sensor so he wouldn't accidentally move it. Then he grabbed one of the bombs from Yuki's tail, a single fluffy limb extending out to meet him and retrieve the grasper from the side of his bag. He tried not to run his fingers through the silky fur for too long. Setup was simple. Grab the bomb with the rod, flip the safety toggle, hold the rod out, and release. Without a sound, the roughly head-sized bag hovered in the air, completely unmoving, rain gently pattering against it. John let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, and tried to yank the disc claw free. It didn't move, courtesy of the complete lack of leverage that he had on the disc. Grunting, he moved the hover disk back while holding on tight, slowly pulling the device from the slowing field like a stick from a particularly thick mud. "Next heading?" John asked. "We're on a timer here." 7 3/4, Yuki rattled off, and John adjusted his heading without complaint. A minute passed. 2, 3. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you, John," Yuki murmured into his ear, drawing a shiver from the man. "You knew," John Histon returned, but made no effort to shift away from her grasp. "How long were you going to let me think that he was still alive?" A quiet second, as the Kitsune let him stew. "Not until after the Nameless and Kiku are dead, I think. I didn't want you to have to sprint through the process of grieving, while having the need to act nipping at your heels. You would have been even angrier than you are now at me for hiding it. But, you deserve the chance to feel. You would have found comfort with Rin or Yusuko, and you would have time to work through the pain of leaving behind someone who might have become a friend." Despite himself, something in his shoulders thumped at a frank admission. "He was a good man, Yuki. He didn't deserve what Kiku did to him," John muttered. "He didn't," Yuki echoed. Quiet engulfed them once more, words that might have been lost to the rain and dark. Soon enough, they were at a second sight, and a few words passed between them that weren't directions as they flew towards the third. As they left, John couldn't help but peer into the darkness, seeing if he could get some glimpse of the evil that dwelt below. Again, nothing but darkness greeted him like an all-encompassing shroud. "Do you think that we could have saved them?" John finally asked, breaking the silence. "You couldn't, but I could have," Yuki sighed, a hint of melancholy infecting her voice. John jolted, spinning to look at her, the best he could from his position, only catching the barest hints of expression through the dark, casting her pale fur in deep shades while completely enshrouding the greys, making her look like a ghost stepping out of the night. "Yuki?" "If I had figured out what she was planning sooner, I could have ordered Rin to stop them, and the world is dimmer for their absence." A hand rested upon his own unarmored one. "If you must blame somebody, don't blame yourself. Blame me," Yuki whispered into his ear. A whole body shudder came over him as he grasped her hand with his own. "No," he spat. "She's smart, and she knows you. If she were that easy to outthink, we wouldn't be in the forest setting up." John paused, narrowing his eyes. "I see what you're doing," he flatly responded. "Don't tear yourself apart like this, John," she huskily whispered, pulling him closer. "What the hell else am I supposed to do, Yuki? I can't bring back the dead," he muttered back. "The best you can, of course," she stated, slightly mussing his hair. "Make life worth living. Help the people you can. You were never meant to carry the world, my friend. You're just a little piece of it. Even the guards at the apex of the power couldn't aid all their followers." John leaned into her arms, eyes closed. "I hate when you're right," he groaned. Yuki said nothing, but the rest of their flight went smoothly. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.